Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. About a month ago, we had the pleasure of interviewing the president of the Canadian Bar Association, at least the then president of the Canadian Bar Association, the first African-Canadian in that position. And now it's a real pleasure of me to introduce you to the new president of the Canadian Bar Association, Brad Regehr. He's a lawyer and partner at Maurice Law in Winnipeg, and he's the newly elected president of the Canadian Bar Association, and he's the first Indigenous person to be a member of president of the Canadian Bar Association.
Yes,
is that the case?
Thanks for having me, Brian.
Thank you. So is it important to have the first Indigenous president of the Canadian Bar Association, or is it not important?
No, I think it's very important. The organization is over 120 years old, and until last year, they hadn't had anyone in that position who wasn't Caucasian. So I think it's pretty important, long overdue, that the biggest legal association in the country has people who are more reflective of the diversity of Canada. So,
what does it mean to you to be elected as president of the Canadian Bar Association?
Well, I think it's pretty humbling to me. I'm very happy that my colleagues in the association, there's an electoral college who vote in the vice president, and then you become automatically the president after a year. They had the confidence in electing me to that position in terms of and knowing that I would lead the organization this year. So I'm very humbled that they decided that they wanted me to lead the organization, and I think it's. I just feel very lucky that I'm getting to do that and getting to fill this role.
Are there specific issues that are critically important to you?
Well, one of the main things that I'm trying to do this year is continue the work the association is doing on the Truth and Reconciliation calls to action. That's pretty important to me. My father went to residential school for his entire primary education. Not a great experience. Impacts of that, of course, reverberated down through the generations, as it did with so many families. And and the calls to action they're pretty broad. And I want to see, for my part, I want to see and do what I can to see those get fully implemented.
And what specifically can either the Canadian Bar Association or the president of the Canadian Bar Association do in that regard? Isn't most of that federal government actions?
Well, I think as an association, one of the things that we have is an advocacy role. And that is we do advocate with the federal government, the national body does. We have branches who deal with the provinces and territories. But we have that role, and we're there to, ask the government, what is it doing to implement the calls to action, and if a call to action hasn't been implemented, to ask why. Another role that we feel that we have is educating lawyers, and that's one of the calls to action is lawyers to educate themselves on the history of residential schools, the legal issues affecting Indigenous people, and we've done that. We have developed a continuing professional development program called The Path. We did with a partner based out of Ottawa. And that has had great take-up in the legal community. We only launched that in June. We've had over 1,000 of our members take the course already. We've had law societies want to sign up for the program to provide to their members. We've had 3 different schools, one of which has already established that their first-year lawyers will take the mini course, and the other 2 are negotiating with us about getting access to it. We've had big national law firms want to get a license from us to provide to all their lawyers and their clients. So it's been a real success, and I'm really heartened by that.
We're chatting tonight with Brad Regehr. He is a lawyer and a partner at Maurice Law in Winnipeg, and he's the newly elected president of the Canadian Bar Association, the first Indigenous person to be president of the Canadian Bar Association in the 124-year history of the CBA. We're going to take a break for some messages and be right back in just a minute. I'm going to ask Brad about race relations. I'm going to ask him about some of the legal cases that he's argued, and we're going to have hopefully a good conversation about Indigenous issues and the Canadian Bar Association in Canada today. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with Brad Regehr. He is president, the first Indigenous president of the Canadian Bar Association in its 124 history. Mr. Regehr, I understand that you had an interesting and different childhood. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I was a child of the 60s scoop. Placed into first, I was in a foster home, and then was adopted into a non-Indigenous family here in Winnipeg, and that's where I was raised, in a neighborhood called Fort Garry. I grew up with loving parents. I've said that I was one of the lucky ones, and that I was adopted into a loving, caring home. They never hid from me who I was. They never hid from me that I was adopted. And certainly when I made that choice that I wanted to find my biological family, they were completely supportive of it, never threatened by it. So that was great. Grew up, and then went on to post-secondary education. I should say I had another sister who was also adopted and was Indigenous.
Into the same family or different family? Same family.
She was. I was of Cree background. She was of Métis background. So we were adopted into the same family. I had an uncle who worked with Indigenous people. That's what he did, and he would often talk to me about Indigenous issues and those kinds of things. And I admit struggling with my identity, trying to figure out who I was, because I always felt that there was something different about me. I always felt that there were people out there who were, like me, who looked like me, or maybe sort of looked like me at least. Might have laughed the same way I did, acted the same way I did. I didn't know. And so, I always trying to figure out who you are, where you come from, more about your background. And then once I was in university, actually it was my first year law school, I was able to meet my biological family. And I met my biological mother and my siblings. And it was just kind of an awe-inspiring. It was over a weekend where I met almost everybody, and it was just it was overwhelming. And on the Monday morning, I was supposed to write a contracts midterm, and I went into my professor's office and I just said, "So I'm going to tell you what happened on my weekend. This is what happened, and just hopefully you can take that into account when I bomb the exam." And he just looked at me and said, "You're going to write it next week. Go home." He said, "I'm not going to make you write the midterm right now." And that was pretty awesome. And when I became president a month ago, actually that professor who's now retired, living out in Victoria, sent me an email congratulating me, and just reminiscing about that conversation we had over 25 years ago.
How did you find your biological family?
Well, my mom, my adopted mom, who I call my mom, she, if you met her, you would never expect this. But when they were in the social worker's office and the social worker got up to go out, she sort of, stretched her neck out and sort of looked at the file a little bit and saw some names and stuff. Particularly, she saw what my name was given to me when I was born, and an important thing there is she saw what my last name was, and of course they renamed me when I was adopted, and she had a note from the foster family. She had some other information, and I was able to do some searches. Some people helped me look around, hear things, and there was able to make my last name was Bear. So if you're out in the prairies, the last name Bear can be there's a whole number of communities spread across the prairies where Bear, the surname Bear, could be quite popular. So, and I knew that there was communities here in Manitoba which had the last name Bear, but they're predominantly Ojibwe community. And I was always told, well, I was Cree, so how does that work? And then there was a suggestion, well, you might need to look elsewhere. And so some people did some phone calls for me, and they actually traced the name to Sandy Bay, Saskatchewan, which is just across the border from Puckatawaga, Manitoba. They're 60 miles apart down the Churchill River. And they phoned the local CFS worker and just said, we have a young man in Winnipeg. This was his name when he was born. And the woman just started freaking out. And it was my aunt. She said, we've been looking for him for so long. We wondered whatever happened to him.
Really?
And yeah, it was quite something. And then I talked to that aunt too, and she was crying. I was crying. Everybody was crying. It was.
And do you stay in touch with your biological family?
Yeah, I have. Primarily with my siblings. My biological mother passed away about 21 years ago. But I have most of my siblings are actually, we're in Winnipeg. Still quite a few are actually in Winnipeg. I have a brother in Saskatchewan, a brother in Alberta, and a sister who lives in Seville, Spain. So certainly the ones in Winnipeg I'm in contact with quite regularly, and then the ones out in the other provinces a little less so.
And were they put up for adoption, put into foster homes, or did they were they raised by your mother?
I was the only one who was. She came down from Sandy Bay to schooling in Winnipeg and met someone, and as those things happen, I came along, and I don't know the full story of what happened when she gave birth. She's passed away, so I can't ask her anymore. What happened, but next thing you know, I was up for adoption. I can remember, I've met some cousins who live here and had an aunt who lived here, or my mom's aunt lived here, and they remember being little girls and remember Yvonne living with them, and she was getting a bigger belly, and then figured out she was pregnant, and they were all excited because there was going to be a baby in the house, and then she went to the hospital and she didn't come back, and there was no baby. So I don't know the full story of what happened, other than, it's been confirmed for me that I'm a 60 scoop kid.
And when she returned to Saskatchewan, was it a reservation that she was living in, or?
No, she moved up to Thompson, Manitoba, and then lived there and was living there when I met her, 25 years later.
What would your life have been different? How would it have been different, do you think? It's really hard to say. I think I have found the family where my biological father came from. If I have the correct person, he passed away many years ago. I don't know anything about them. So at best I can guess. They were from Winnipeg, and then if I have the person right, they were in Southern Alberta. So I probably would have grown up in Calgary and been a Flames fan. God forbid. Unless they didn't sit, my mom and my biological father didn't stay together, and she met another guy, and they moved to Thompson, and then they had my two younger brothers. I'll be honest. I don't think that union was always the happiest, and they broke up. So I'm not sure whether that would have been the greatest thing for me. My siblings are who they are, and I love them to pieces. But certainly they had a different upbringing than I did, by being adopted. So you're
necessarily be in this position. I'm not sure I would be.
You're a unique and obviously a very successful adoption example. And there's been lots of Indigenous children that have been put up for adoption, some that have been sent to residential schools maybe a generation ago, not your generation, and others that have grown up with their families, whether in cities or on reservations. What do you take out of all of your experience? Are you just unique, or you lucked out by being raised by a loving family?
Yeah, and I've met other people who lucked out just like me, and I know other people who did not have good experiences. there's a project now where kids from the 60s Scoop it's a mapping project, and so you put down where you were adopted from and where you grew up, and it's incredible to see kids coming from all over Canada and being adopted into the United Kingdom, into the Netherlands. Like, it's that diaspora of children from the 60s and 70s. It's shocking.
Why? There was just a policy that we wanted to take as many kids out of their families and adopt them away.
It was an ongoing program that just evolved out of John A. Macdonald's wish to get rid of the Indian. And there was always this
continued into the 60s and 70s, the 1960s and 1970s.
I don't think the people who developed the policy were necessarily going, well, what would John A. Macdonald do and what would Duncan Campbell Scott do? But I think it was a way of, it was a thought pattern and an ongoing bias that carried on through the decades. And then in the 60s, you had some sort of thought that, well, these kids aren't growing up properly, so we're just going to take them away and put them in non-Indigenous families because they had such a better upbringing. And yeah, I've seen the advertisements they put in newspapers where they had pictures. Little girl A, available for adoption. Call this number. Little boy B, available for, like, put them in the classifieds. Here's all these kids come and adopt, and it wasn't just in Canada. There was kids shipped all over the United States.
Okay, but we do have a real issue in some communities where drinking water is bad, education is bad, alcoholism is rampant, not a lot of jobs, poor housing, etc. What's the solution? Is the solution to have the kids be adopted into non-Indigenous communities, or is it a massive investment in those Indigenous communities, or what is the solution? You must have thought about this quite a bit.
Sure, and I don't have a magic wand to come up with a solution, but I think investment in those communities, appropriate social service supports, that kind of thing, investment in education, I think are big things. I'm a lawyer, so I work in the legal system, and I don't do criminal defense work, but I certainly know that at this point we've got a big problem. It doesn't take me long to look at the statistics in terms of who's going through the criminal defense system. Well, disproportionately, it's Indigenous people. Who's going through the child welfare system? Well, disproportionately, it's Indigenous people who are going through that. And, there's all this talk about, well, we got to put more money into justice, more money into, CFS agencies. And I kind of think, well, maybe if some of those dollars into education, more into other social services, economic development, that might go a longer way, and we might not have so many people in those systems on a disproportionate basis. I mean, these problems have been studied numerous times. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is probably one of the latest to look at some of these root causes, but certainly it's been looked at, and I don't know. It's going to take a big effort, but it can't be non-Indigenous Canadians going, here's what we think the solution is. It's got to be, I've said it before, it's got to be involving Indigenous people and led by Indigenous people. It can't be outside, interests coming in going, well, we think this is what's going to work for you.
Who are you?
Sorry?
Who are you? Are you Indigenous? Or are you Caucasian? Are you a product of your genetics? Or are you a product of who raised you? Or you a product of your research into your biological family in your student years? Who are you?
I think I'm an influence of a whole bunch of things that were influenced on my life. I'm not going to get into the nature versus nurture debate because, well, that's not my expertise. I don't,
But do you think of yourself as Indigenous, or do you think of yourself as, okay. And what have you done to explore your Indigenous background? You say you found out your biological family. You said you had an uncle that sort of educated you on Indigenous issues when you were growing up. Was that an important part of your education?
I think so. I mean, he was doing this with a kid who, I was a kid. I was interested in doing kid things like playing and that kind of stuff. So, I'm not, I wasn't some revolutionary at 10 years old. I wanted to go catch with a dog. I thought about these things. I think there was some other things going on in the 1980s, which started to inform me. The Charter of Rights and Freedoms came down, and then a few years later we had Section 35, and then we had all of a sudden, in 1990 we had Meech Lake and Oka. A couple of years later we had Charlottetown, and these things were all informing me in terms of my political thinking.
Tell me about Section 35.
Section 35 of the Constitution. This is where Aboriginal and treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. It was left out of the 1982 Constitution when it was repatriated, and First Nations, Métis groups, and Inuit groups said, "You can't leave us out." And then there was these were added onto the 1982 Constitution, and that's been that I think led to a whole new era of litigation, cases, policies, that kind of thing, in terms of Canadian political scene, and certainly the Canadian legal scene, because the courts had to start to figure out what all this meant. First Nation groups, I think, knew what it meant, but certainly governments then had to grapple with what they said. And let me tell you, after all these years, are still grappling with what this means. So, and
tell me about Meech Lake and Charlottetown. So, the image I think most of us have from an Indigenous standpoint is, I think it was Elijah Harper that stood up and opposed, and was one of the critical people opposing the Meech Lake Accord. What do you think was the issues in Meech Lake and Charlottetown?
Well, I think what it was, and keep in mind when you're talking Meech Lake, hand in hand with that was the Oka crisis going on at the same time. It was the same, right at the same time, where the Mohawks of Ganasataki, with support from Ganawaki, just said, enough is enough. There's bigger issues to play here, and you're not putting a golf course through our burial grounds. And you got Elijah Harper. So they wanted to do these constitutional amendments, and Elijah Harper, just was like, no, I'm not going to do it. He was the sole MLA in Manitoba standing up and not allowing unanimity to occur. I can tell you for myself, those events really galvanized a lot of my thinking on these issues. Really, I think played a big part in directing me to look towards law. Without even knowing that I was going to ultimately end up, it got me thinking about these things. And then, you had the Charlottetown Accord a couple years later.
Sorry, let me interrupt. I apologize. Explain it. Remind us what Elijah Harper was standing against.
What he was, if I recall correctly, 30 years ago, they required unanimous support in the legislature for the Meech Lake Accord, and he stood there as the sole NDP MLA, because the other NDP MLAs were voting in favor of this, and he was questioning the premier on it. And every time a vote came up, he would say, "No, I don't approve of this." And a lot of pressure was put on him to vote yes. He just repeatedly said no. I have a law professor, and now a friend of mine working at a different law firm, was giving advice to Elijah on that, and to the Assembly Manitoba Chiefs in terms of opposing that, and there was a lot of legislative procedure and that kind of thing. But the position was that the Meech Lake Accord did not deal with Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests and self-government issues at all, really. I know that there was sort of all representations that, just pass this and we'll deal with those things afterwards. And I think people were like, no, we're not going to be an afterthought anymore.
Well, I think it didn't even go farther, because what it was distinct society for Quebecois, and so what, or Quebec. And what his interpretation was is that if we made the founding principles of Canada English and French and left out Indigenous people, it was a complete lie.
Yeah, and I know that there was, people going, just say this is okay, and we'll be your champions on these things going forward. And Indigenous people were going, we'll be our own champions. Thank you. We don't need non-Indigenous people doing this for us. Again, we'll do it, but you're going to engage in conversation with us. And so then you had Charlottetown two years later, which had some provisions, but which ultimately failed when it went to referendum. I remember that occurring when I was in university.
We're chatting tonight with Brad Regehr, who is a lawyer, and he's just been elected the new president of the Canadian Bar Association, the first Indigenous leader of the Canadian Bar Association in its 124-year history. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more. And we're going to talk with Mr. Regehr about a couple of the cases that he's been involved in. Stay with us. Well, we're back on the Canadian Bar Association interview of Brad Regehr, who is the new president of the Canadian Bar Association. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I said the Canadian Bar Association because it's been interesting. I've had the opportunity to interview two presidents of Canadian Bar Association. The last individual was a female and a African Canadian, and she was the first African Canadian president of the Canadian Bar Association, and now they've elected the first Indigenous person. So I think the Canadian Bar Association is probably doing a great job of electing very good people, but also electing people of different backgrounds, and so that's great. Mr. Regehr, one of the biggest issues in the last year, and sort of, it was frankly a big issue prior to COVID-19, was blockages of railways across the country. Because of objections to building a pipeline in British Columbia. Where did you come down on that issue? Did you agree with the blockages of railways? Is it appropriate? Were the people that were doing those blockages justified?
There's a lot of frustration in First Nation communities, Métis communities, Inuit communities. And you have parts of the country where we've got court cases that have said Indigenous people have certain rights. And, you have a place like British Columbia where no treaties were signed. There are maybe a handful of treaties over very tiny areas on Vancouver Island. The rest were not, the rest of the land, it was not subject to treaty. And the courts have ruled numerous times on what the rights of Indigenous people are and their rights to be consulted and accommodated. And what you have then is, in my view, often governments moving in, trying to shortchange those rulings from the court. I mean, we've got massive conflict in Nova Scotia right now over Mi'kmaq, with their moderate livelihood fishery, and all sorts of non-Indigenous fishermen, from what I've seen, engaging in illegal activity over what has been determined to be a legal right. So there's groups of people who they've tried, the rights have been established, and yet they're trodden on, they're run over, and those Indigenous groups feel that, well, there's only thing left to us is to engage in civil disobedience. The history of our country, and certainly the country just to the south of us, has been, is a history of civil disobedience, having to move issues forward. So, I mean, I certainly understand where that frustration came from, and people weren't engaged in violent protests. They were engaged in very peaceful protests, and took action which they viewed as probably one of the more effective ones, and that was sort of hitting things where the money was. I guess deciding to blockade a railroad. Obviously it's going to have an economic impact. they're not hurt. They're not, going and violently hurting anyone, but they're getting that attention and wanting people to come to the table to talk to them and not just ignore them.
One of the issues in BC, I understand, was that the government and the companies thought they had an agreement with the elected chiefs, and then the hereditary chiefs had a different point of view. Can you explain the difference between elected chiefs and hereditary chiefs?
Well, I'll try to. I don't practice in BC, so I'm here in Manitoba. But every community, after all the years I've worked in the area, I've come to certainly understand that every community is unique. Has their own traditions and methods of governance. Certainly, the Indian Act system is there. It was put in place by the federal government. A lot of communities follow that for their governance. But there's other communities who have hereditary systems or other traditional systems. And, you sometimes get into conflicts in communities where there's an Indian Act Chief and Council and a hereditary system. And some communities, they've actually found a way to have the two exist harmoniously. But, Canada's a country built on three legal systems. Everyone figured it was just French civil law and English common law, but Indigenous legal traditions form part of the law of Canada. And need to be respected and need to be taken into account. So, I wasn't involved in that project. I don't know the discussions that were had or what attempts were made to reach out, but, people need to educate themselves a little bit more that what they see on the surface might not be the only thing. They might need to, find out with a community that, okay, you have an Indian Act system, but maybe you also have a hereditary system, and we should be involving the people in the discussions in terms of what's going on.
I understand you've been personally involved in a couple of different First Nation issues, hydroelectric projects, land claims, flooding agreements, treaty land entitlement framework agreements. Tell us a little bit about your experience with those. Do you think our legal system is dealing with them adequately or not?
I have, in my own experience, met a lot of judges who want to learn a lot more about the area, or doing what they can to educate themselves, understanding that there's a different perspective, understanding that there's an Indigenous legal tradition that they're going to have to take into account, understanding that the old ways of doing things, ignoring these rights and interests, just isn't going to work. And, a lot making a real strong effort to do that. Does our legal system have challenges? Absolutely, it has challenges. I think I just a little earlier talked about sort of the rates of disproportionate involvement in the criminal justice and child welfare systems with Indigenous people. But, I saw an interesting report done earlier this year where some people, looked at injunctions and sort of did an analysis of sort of who's using injunctions and who's having injunctions used against them. And it's primarily industry and business who get the injunctions in their favor. And it's disproportionately Indigenous people who have injunctions used against them. And, and the ease of which they seem to be obtained was one of the analyses from these authors. And so, if we're really going to get engaged in reconciliation in this country, then I think we need to have some real hard thinking and discussion on some of the tools which get used against Indigenous people fairly regularly. So does the legal system have some challenges? Absolutely.
So we've had a lot of.
I try not to be critical, but when a 14-year-old girl gets shot and killed by police officers here in Winnipeg after a high-speed chase, I'm left going, what's happening here? What is going on here? Why is this occurring? Because it's not acceptable. It's not acceptable. She's 14 years old. She wasn't running around. I mean, you know, and I'll probably get criticized for this, but so be it. As far as I know, she wasn't running at the police officers with an AK-47, firing it wildly from the hip. I'm not sure what she was armed with, but, you know, shot and killed. There's something going on, and things got to change.
So there's been a lot of conversations across North America after George Floyd in Minneapolis back in the spring in regard to systematic racism against Blacks. Is there systematic racism against Indigenous people in Canada?
Absolutely. Absolutely, without a doubt. Again, I just need to look at the criminal justice system and look at the rates. I need to look at the child welfare system and look at the rates. I need to look at the stats in terms of who's being shot by the police and who's dying from those shootings. It's disproportionately Indigenous people and people of color. You know, I've met lots of police officers. I have a good friend who's a former police officer, and there's lots of good people. But, you know, unfortunately, I'm going to say it, there's some bad apples in there, but there's also attitudes. And, you know, I think some of our approaches to policing need to change. This sort of win at all costs attitude that seems to be prevalent in a lot of police departments needs to be replaced with something that, you know, I'm not a policing expert. As I said earlier, I don't practice in criminal defense. I've never been a Crown prosecutor, but I've studied a lot of these issues for a long time. You know, I represent primarily First Nations and see the impacts that it has on those communities and families in those communities. And it seems to me that it's broken and it needs to be fixed.
So you talk about some of the statistics, and I think the statistics are pretty stark. And I had a couple of people on my show that went through just the Toronto examples, but you know, the percentage of the population that is African Canadian that's Black versus the percentage of the population that is Black in prisons is like a factor of 5. So there's 5 times as many people that are Black in prisons from a proportion as they are in the population. But for Indigenous, it was almost 100.
Yeah. Yeah, it's shocking. And I can't remember what it is out here. Years ago, I saw some stats in Manitoba. It was Indigenous people make up 10% of the population of Manitoba and yet make up, I think, 60% of the population in provincial correctional institutions. It's amazing.
Why is that? You said attitudes. Is it, do we grow up racist? Do we not meet Aboriginal peoples in schools? How were you dealt with? How were you treated at school?
You know, there's different sort of, different intensities, different levels of racism. Were things said to me? Yes, I remember being called a number of different things. I'm not going to repeat it here. You know, I can remember, you know, everything from sort of the overt name calling to just the benign attitudes that people have, or, you know, and then when I went east in Ontario and was at school and running to people who had never met an Indigenous person in their entire life, and grew up with these sort of fairy tale notions and just things that they had heard. It was I think one guy asked me, well, you could ride a horse bareback, couldn't you? And I was like, I'm Cree, I'm from northern Saskatchewan. We didn't have any bloody horses up there. We you know, we paddled canoes and traveled on the, you know, the waterway. Like, where is this coming from? And it was just like, it was unbelievable, because I thought, no one thinks that kind of stuff anymore, right? But it's, you know, like I said, it's anywhere from the overt to the benign. It's still out there. You know, I mean, some people grow up overtly racist, absolutely, but, you know, kids. I mean, I got 3 kids myself, and where do they learn most of their stuff from? Their parents, right? Their surrounding family. So kids hear stuff and it gets into your head, and that's the way you start to think. But
So to get rid of systematic racism, we've got to start in the family.
Yeah, I think it's education. It's education within the family. It's education. I remember reading history books when I was in elementary, being ashamed of who I was, because apparently, we liked to kill the courier de bois and cut their hearts out and eat them. These bloodthirsty savages, and those were books that we read in public school in the 1970s and 80s. It's not something I made up. That's what I was taught. And maybe we should flip the coin and look at this a different way and look. Well, maybe the British went to punish the Mohawks for being so nasty. Well, then what did they do? Well, they went and burned their villages down and burnt their foodstuffs and killed anyone they found. Isn't that genocide?
Do you think it was?
Well, I think to a certain extent it was. If you go in and you destroy where they're living and destroy their foodstuffs and kill anyone you can find, don't we have examples of that happening all around the world, and especially in the more recent past? It's more taught that, well, we're going to teach these nasty savages a lesson.
We're chatting with Brad Regehr, who is the newly elected president of the Canadian Bar Association. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with a couple of concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, a fascinating conversation tonight with Brad Regehr. He is the newly elected president of the Canadian Bar Association. He's a lawyer and a partner at Maurice Law in Winnipeg, and he's the first Indigenous person elected as president of the Canadian Bar Association. Interesting enough, he was the first leader of the Manitoba Bar Association that was Indigenous as well. Brad, I wonder if I could ask you a couple of questions just to finish up here, because I think it's been an interesting conversation that a lot of us probably don't spend enough time thinking about. I think it was Abraham Lincoln that said that slavery was the original sin of the United States. Is something in regards to how we've treated our Indigenous people the original sin of Canada?
Well, you make a good point. Arguably, I think it could be. It could be because when Europeans came here, they had to have those interactions with Indigenous people, and I don't think it was always that friendly. And it seemed to be a program of dispossession, and we'll have these agreements for you, but we're going to break them pretty quickly, and we're just going to keep creeping westward and take what we can, and we'll confine you to the reserves. We'll attack your settlements. We'll take your kids away. We'll, send them to residential school. And when that doesn't work, we'll just take them away and send them to other families, around the world. We've had a lot of talk of reconciliation. I'm a big proponent of reconciliation. I mean, we're all here now. But I think we need to recognize that Indigenous people have a pretty special and unique place within Canada. And the more people recognize that, I think the more we can come about, reconciling between larger Canadian society and Indigenous people. And but it's going to take an understanding and an appreciation for what has occurred. And that's why, I'm a big proponent of education on these issues. And certainly with the Bar Association, that's one thing we're doing, is trying to educate lawyers. But, there's a lot more people in the country than lawyers. I mean, it just happens to be
I read a great story in the New York Times this past weekend that Dan Levy, who is the author, screenwriter, and actor in Schitt's Creek, every Sunday convenes a big online class with some Indigenous professors from Alberta to educate him better on Indigenous issues, so that he can, number one, understand, but also number two, write better screenplays. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and maybe we all should join in a weekly update history lesson on Indigenous activities. But reconciliation and education is one thing. What about economics? What about social? What do we actually need to do? If you were Prime Minister, if you were a Minister of Aboriginal Affairs, what would you be doing?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure I would actually take that portfolio. I mean, I can remember Jody Wilson-Raybould saying that. I mean, she she was approached about being one of those two ministers, and she was, I can't do that. Given the history, as an Indigenous person, I can't take that position. Being Minister of Justice was one thing, and she, had her own initiatives there, but from what I've heard was that she was simply wouldn't take those other positions. I think it's really sitting down with Indigenous people and going, okay, we got to get this figured out, because and Indigenous people have been saying we got to get this figured out, and Indigenous people have had a number of solutions. Obviously, that part of reconciliation is negotiating and probably some compromise, but it's going to take a full team effort on this thing to get this resolved.
Have your kids been bullied at school for their background, and if they were, what would you say to them?
They've never said anything to me about being bullied. There is of Indian background whose family came from South Africa, and they left South Africa in the late 60s because they were not white and wanted to go somewhere that had a better opportunity for their children. So they grew up with that kind of discrimination. My boys, my wife and I have raised them, knowing who they are, knowing their various backgrounds, and to, not to be ashamed of that. I want to be able to say that I think when I grew up, it was a lot different than the era they're growing up. Certainly where I live in Winnipeg, Winnipeg has become a lot more diverse than when I was a kid, way more diverse. And we live in a fairly nice neighborhood in Winnipeg. But even that neighborhood, its diversity is changing. But I would tell them that someone says something, ask them, why are you saying that to me? Like, why are you treating me this way? Why do you think I'm so different? Why do you feel that you can say those things to me? That's what I would tell my boys to say.
Brad Regehr, president of the Canadian Bar Association.
If it got worse than that, I might tell them to do something else, but I'm not going to say that on radio. So.
Brad Regehr, president of the Canadian Bar Association, first Indigenous president of the Canadian Bar Association. I hope you make a difference, because I think you can. And good luck. Thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.
Maybe I can just finish with a couple of words. I do think that the way that we in Canada have treated our Indigenous peoples is probably our original sin. And I do think that we have got to go through a reconciliation. We've got to go through an education, and we've got to invest in economic programs and social programs. And you know what? This CERB that so many people have been enjoying and been taking advantage of during the pandemic, I think proves out that, in tough times, people deserve some economic assistance from the government. Well, you know what? We've got to be more generous with economic assistance to all people, whether they're Aboriginal or African Canadians or whatever, their ethnic background and their situation, because I think everyone deserves a good start, a good education, a good job, a good opportunity in life. And I think that we have not provided that in the past to our Aboriginal brothers in the Canadian story. So I hope we change that. Thanks for joining us tonight. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Good night.